Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Mikael Zolyan. He is a political analyst, and he is here today to talk to us about the privilege and gift of independence. September 21, 1991 changed the narrative of the Armenian people. We voted overwhelmingly for independence. And today we are celebrating the 22nd anniversary of that independence. We often talk about the collective hardships and the challenges that we faced and we continue to face. And in that cynicism and in those dark moments, we forget about the real privilege of what it means to have independence. Mikael, you straddle both worlds, Soviet, post-Soviet. And you are part of that generation today in Armenia that I consider, the bright, forward-looking, progressive, brilliant generation who can make things happen in Armenia, hopefully soon. What for you, what does independence for your generation, for someone like yourself, mean today?
Oh, I can't talk for my whole generation because I think my generation is exactly the most torn generation.
The most torn?
Yeah, because some people in my generation, they are very enthusiastic about independence. Some people are still, they still have some kind of nostalgia for Soviet times, which they didn't really know, but somehow, people who are 10 years younger than me, they tend to have, they don't really have this nostalgic feelings usually. People 10 years older than me, they're much more probable to have this, it's much more possible that they have these feelings. My generation is very different, so I can't even say what does my generation think about independence in general. I think it's very divided. And unfortunately, my generation was also probably one of the most, people from my generation are more likely to have emigrated. People who I studied with, people who I went to school with or to university, a lot of them, they don't live in Armenia now, and I can't blame them, but also I think collectively our generation has to understand that, somehow we fail to appreciate the independence. We fail to understand that it's not just a privilege, it's a responsibility. And by leaving the country, you're making a choice which has consequences. Of course, in each individual case, this choice was probably understandable. And a lot of people, I'm not blaming anyone, but when this choice becomes a trend, when this becomes, numbers are adding up, and eventually at some point you can see that you don't have an independent country anymore.
Because you don't have anybody living there anymore who is going to protect it. Somebody earlier said today that when we talk about independence, we understand freedom, we understand social justice, we understand democracy, cohesion, a social consciousness among society, members in society, and that we have to internalize those values individually. We have to be democratic as individuals then to become part of the collective. And we often talk about the failure of leadership in Armenia in the past 20 years, perhaps even, if we're being very critical. As a young political analyst, as somebody who is engaged in Armenia's processes, how do we begin to change that paradigm? How do we elevate that consciousness individually to then be able to collectively start making fundamental change in Armenia?
I think part of the problem is our concept of the nation. It's a very ethnic, very sometimes cultural maybe, but not political concept. Which is understandable because Armenians have lived as communities within larger empires for the last at least 600 years on some parts. Basically, if we're talking about Armenia proper, almost 1,000 years. And about 1,000 years ago, Armenians basically gave up their independence and joined the Byzantine Empire, and then they were conquered by others, and they are used to this kind of position of a community, ethno-religious community within a larger empire. which doesn't really have responsibility for choosing its own destiny. It can only try to preserve its culture. So maybe 100 years ago, 200 years ago, this was okay. But now, if you try to build your own statehood, you need to change your concept of nation. You have to move further than that. You have to build a political nation, a civic nation, a nation which is tied together not by some kind of food or even religion, but by constitution, by rights and duties, which unfortunately even the intellectuals today in Armenia, a lot of them, they don't really perceive the nation that way. So the leadership, they are responding to the general vision which exists in the society. So
and they are a product of that society.
They are a product of that society. So unfortunately, there was a time when there was a group in Armenian, both political, among the politicians and among intellectuals, who actually had this vision of a civic nation, which they started building that in the early 90s, but then something went wrong, and the more we are becoming older as an independent state, unfortunately, we are moving further away from this concept of a political nation.
Well, as we enter the third decade, we are already in the third decade of independence, perhaps what we need is a national discourse or dialogue of what we understand when we say the word nation or nation state. But at the same time, I think that we have much to be thankful for because we do have the foundation upon which to build. I'd like to wish you a happy Independence Day, happy birthday for all of us. And if there's any final last, not to be a preacher obviously, but how would you like to see Armenia moving forward?
I think we are, now we are going maybe through a difficult period, and when we're talking about independence of Armenia, there are a lot of questions arising how independent Armenia really is, but I think that we're lucky that today, now we're living in a time when independent states don't usually get annexed by other empires.
Hopefully.
So we were lucky, we got that independence, and even though we don't seem to know how to handle it, what had been done in 1991, it will be much more difficult to undo than it seems. So I'm mostly optimistic.
Thank you very much. Our guest at CivilNet was Mikael Zolyan. He's a political analyst. Thank you for watching.